Thank you, Joshua, and good evening. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, I am Maureen Blanc, a trustee and your moderator for this evening. It is now my distinct pleasure to introduce tonight's distinguished guest. Andrew Guzman is a professor of law and director of the Advanced Law Degree Programs at Berkeley Law School, University of California, Berkeley. Guzman holds a JD and PhD in economics from Harvard University. He has written extensively on international trade, international regulatory matters, foreign direct investment, and public international law, and served as editor on the most recently published Handbook of International Economic Law, and authored How International Law Works. Guzman is a member of the Institute for Transnational Arbitration's Academic Council and is on the board of several academic journals. Ladies and gentlemen, here to speak about climate change, more than an environmental challenge, please welcome Professor Andrew Guzman.
Well, thank you. Let me thank all of you for being here. Thank the World Affairs Council for inviting me and Maureen for moderating. This is a great chance to talk about my book, Overheated, but really more importantly about the topic of climate change. And I want to start with why I wrote the book, because that's a question that comes up a lot, asked by, among others, my mother. She says, you went to graduate school in economics, and you went to law school, and now you're writing about climate change. What's going on? And the answer to that question is central to the point I want to make in the book, which is partly that it's not only a scientific question, it's a question about human systems and human institutions, which is something both economists and lawyers study all the time. But it's also that if I can convince my mother about the seriousness of climate change, and people like my mother, by which I mean thoughtful, intelligent, curious people who aren't particularly focused on this problem, who have other things to do with their lives, who have mortgages to pay or kids to get to school or jobs to worry about or whatever it is that occupies us in our daily lives. If I can convince people like that of the seriousness of the problem, then I think there's hope that we can make real progress. And what I want to convince people of, what I want to convince you of, the sort of task I've set for myself, is to persuade you that climate change isn't a series of bad things that are going to happen to us, each of which we have to deal with, that it's a more pervasive problem than that it strikes the very foundation of our civilization. And one way to measure that is in lives. And I want to convince you that the kind of numbers we're talking about are hundreds of millions of people killed by climate change in this century, and billions of people whose lives are seriously affected in a negative way. Those are big numbers, and in my book I say, this all sounds alarmist. And then the next sentence is, that's because we should be alarmed. That is, I'm conscious of how large these numbers are and how dramatic these claims can sound. So what I'm hoping to do is that by the time I'm done talking, you will think them a little less dramatic, or rather, maybe dramatic and realistic, not hyperbolic. So let me start with the billions. That's actually the easier part of my case. That billions of people on the planet will see their lives dramatically worsened. To frame this a little more precisely, let me suggest a number like 1 out of every 2 people would be a reasonable estimate, perhaps a low estimate. And the answer is climate change is going to do a lot of bad things, but what I want to focus on today is one thing, or one word, and that's glaciers. You've heard it said probably that, well, climate change is a problem because mountain glaciers are receding. Well, first, receding means melting and going away. And the problem is a little more serious than that sounds. That is the problem, but it sounds more serious. Glaciers are a really amazing natural phenomenon. And human beings figured this out somewhere possibly as far back as 12,000 BC, when we started gathering in permanent communities rather than being nomadic. And the reason they're wonderful things is that we need water, and we need water every day. And in much of the world, the water's not there every day. It doesn't rain equally all year round. And so we need to gather the water when it falls as precipitation. So it's available later in the year when it's not raining or snowing. And that turns out to be hard to do on a large scale. So what we've done is we found glaciers. And if you look around the world, you look at where the glaciers are, you look at where the people are, you might have this reaction. You might say, that is an amazing coincidence. that the glaciers just happen to be in just the right spot so that large population centers, large and small, benefit from them when they need them. But of course, that's exactly backwards. The glaciers aren't where they are conveniently. The humans are where we are because the glaciers are where they are, right? We use the glaciers as our water storage tanks. And when they go away, we don't have that water. So let me tell you a story that starts with an indigenous tribe in Bolivia called the Uruchipaya. Now, the Uruchipaya settled thousands of years ago, pretty much where they are now. So before Bolivia was Bolivia, and indeed before the Incan Empire existed, they were there. And they had a pretty good strategy, which was they found a river, it's called the Lauca River, and they settled there. And that river has sustained them ever since, until now. That river is now, at least in the dry season, described as a trickle, and they don't have enough water to sustain themselves, and they know it. And they say, a quote from one of their leaders, "We are at risk of extinction. If there is no water, the Chipaya have no life." In the cruel irony category, they've, for reasons that they're sort of lost in the mists of time, they're called, the Uruchipaya themselves are called water beings. And now their water is disappearing on them. And they don't have a backup plan. And if you were the Uruchipaya, you wouldn't have a backup plan either, because you've been doing the same thing generation after generation for a very long time. But climate change is causing the Andean glaciers that produce the Lauca River to shrink. That means in the wet season there's more floods, which are not helpful, and in the dry season there's more drought. And so they are unlikely to last much longer, and they know it. So I'm trying to convince you that half the world's population is in trouble. I just got 2,000 people. That's 5/100,000%. I'm going to speed up a little bit. So that story, I like that story because it's so simple. There's one river, one small group of people who've been there for a very long time, and that relationship is breaking down. But in fact, that very same story can be told over and over again all over the world. It just gets a little more complicated when it's not so simple, but it's the same story. So from the Uruchipaya, we can go to La Paz, the capital of Bolivia, or for that matter, Bolivia generally speaking. Two of the biggest cities, two of the three largest cities in Bolivia, rely on Andean glaciers for 40% of their water. And those glaciers are disappearing. Where's that water going to come from? Nobody knows. Or more accurately, it's not going to come from anywhere. They're just not going to be as much. Or rather, again, correcting myself, there's going to be the same amount of water is going to. It's hard to predict what climate change is going to do to precipitation in any one place. So even if the same amount of water falls, it's not going to be available all year round in the way that people need. And so you get that same story in Bolivia, you get it in much of Ecuador, you get it in much of Peru, you get it in much of Chile, a big chunk of South America. There's another place you're familiar with that it happens, and that's California. In California, it's not technically a mountain glacier, it's the Sierra snowpack, but the dynamics are the same. Precipitation falls, in our case in the winter. It's stored as ice and snow, and then the meltwater from that glacier provides us with water. We get about 35% of our water in California from there. By 2050, the water we get will be reduced by something on the order of 25 to 40%. And you already know everything there is to know about the plan to deal with that, at least as far as I know. So what happens, and the 25 to 40% is probably an underestimate of the problem California is going to face, because the shrinking glaciers, or in this case the shrinking snowpack, have two problems. One is there's just less water there, so the runoff is less generous in the dry season. The other problem is the world's warmer, so the ice and snow that is there melts earlier. In California, that might be about a month earlier, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it means that the runoff that comes down early in the melt season isn't as needed. We've still got wet fields, we've still got reservoirs that are full from the rain, and so that water is lost to the ocean. And then later in the season, and later in the dry season when we need it, it's not there anymore. So the impact is a little greater than the shrinking suggests, because we also get this early runoff. So okay, so I've got now much of South America, I've got California, but if you think for a minute, I say 1 out of every 2 people, you know where I've got to go next, right? I've got to go to China and India, because that's where they all are. So China and India is not a very hard story. It's exactly the same story. It's Himalayan glaciers now, feeding major rivers. So I want to identify some of these rivers. And I'm going to name some rivers that are fed by glaciers that are threatened, that are disappearing. And I'm going to give a number of people that live in the river basin. So here we go. The Indus River, 178 million people. The Ganges River, 407 million people. The Yangtze River, 369 million people. The Yellow River, 147 million people. The Brahmaputra River, 119 million people. The Sirdam and Amur River, 41 million. The Tarim River, 8 million. Right? So now I'm in business, right? Now I've done something. Whatever that adds up to, which is well over 1 billion, just in that part of the world. Right? All of those rivers will have the same effect. The same experience that the Uruchipai are facing will be faced by those rivers and the people who rely on them. And just as a footnote, when I said the Tarim River, 8 million people, did you say, oh, that's just a little one? Right? Because when it's after 369 million, 407 million, it seems like a trifle. And this is what happens when we talk about climate, because it changes everywhere in the world. That's the nature of climate. The scale gets so big so fast that our intuitions fail us. If I say 100 million people or I say 150 million people, it's not clear that means something different. And that's part of what we have to keep in mind, which I just throw it as a footnote, because 8 million people, that's a lot of people. But it's a river that's kind of a detail on that list. So the story then is virtually all the glaciers in the world are shrinking and will eventually disappear. Some of them in the not too distant future, some of them a little farther out. By 2100, there'll be a large share of them gone. I should add, by the way, Europe doesn't escape, right? The Alps in Europe provide lots of water to important rivers in Europe. They too are shrinking. If you add this up, and I haven't identified them all, but if you add this up, you get to between 2 and 3 billion people who live in these kinds of areas. Now, those people are not all going to be without water. There's still going to be water at least, let's say, to the end of the century in some of those areas all year round. But they're all going to be affected. And if you're in California, one of the richest places in the world, the water stressed already, it seems like it's going to be a problem. It seems like, well, there's going to be fights between the farmers and the business people and the environmentalists and everyone else over this shrinking store of water. And that's going to be a problem. And there's going to be economic dislocation and economic suffering. If you're in Peru, the problem's a little more serious because they don't have as much wealth to cushion the blow. If you're in India or China, at least if you're poor in India or China, same problem. So this is real hardship, really devastating the lives of a lot of people. Now, I can't actually get to half the world's population just with glaciers, but there are other things that we know are going to happen that get me there without any trouble. But I can, if you, in what might be perceived as cheating but is nonetheless correct, get to not just half the world's population, but everybody on the planet, which is when the glaciers shrink and some start disappearing, and we have this effect of their water cycle, it's not only people who suffer, it's agriculture, less food in a world of a growing population. Well, there's only so many calories we produce every year on the planet. And it's true, an enormous amount is lost to waste and corruption and all that, but we don't know how to make waste and corruption go away. So if we have fewer calories produced, somebody's getting less. And I can tell you who that somebody's not going to be. It's most of the people in this room. The people who are going to get less are the people who are already getting the least because the prices go up. That's how we allocate scarce resources in this world mostly. The prices will go up, and the poorest segments of the globe will simply be priced out of food. And so we will see mass starvation, and we'll see lots of death in that way. But everybody in the planet will face a higher food bill, which means for almost everybody in the planet, there'll be a big hit to their quality of life. That's true of poor people in the United States, for example. Again, most of those people are not poor by global standards at all, but they will see their food bill go up, and that's a real hardship. So let me then use that to transition to my hundreds of millions claim, right? That is people killed, not merely have their lives negatively affected. This is actually a harder claim because there isn't a single story like glaciers that gets you to that kind of scale. There's lots of different ways in which climate change affects society. And part of the point I make in the book is climate change eats at the underpinnings of society. We've built this structure on a set of bedrock assumptions that are no longer good. So we can't just simply assume the structure will continue to stand if the underpinnings are no good. So that's part of the problem. So I'm not going to get actually to hundreds of millions in my remarks, but I'll get partway there. I've already got partway there. That is, some large number of people are going to be killed as the glaciers shrink and they can't get water and they can't get food. But let me turn to a different part of the world and talk about sea rise. And the poster child for sea rise is Bangladesh. Bangladesh is about 150 million people, one of the most populous countries in the world. It's by a wide margin the most densely populated large country in the world, and it's extremely poor. It's also very vulnerable to sea rise. So throughout the book and throughout this talk, I should have said earlier, I am assuming a 2 degrees Celsius increase in temperatures by the end of this century, which is a conservative estimate. That is, if you were actually trying to guess the increase in temperature between now and the end of the century, you'd guess a higher number, at least I would. I picked 2 degrees intentionally so as to kind of rig the system against my argument, because I don't want to be exaggerating the effects by choosing an artificially high temperature change. That 2-degree temperature change then translates into predictions about sea rise, which are complicated because the ice sheets in Antarctica are very hard to predict. But a 1-meter rise in oceans is, again, a conservative estimate based on the 2 degrees increase. A 1-meter rise in the oceans destroys about 17% of Bangladesh. So 17%, let me give you an idea what that means. If the United States were to lose 17%, this is what it would look like, right? So get your little mental map of the United States. The United States would lose Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, right? So you can imagine that kind of strip of states towards the east. All those states would be gone, and every bit of land to the east of those states, right? The entire East Coast. If you think in the West Coast instead, we are West Coasters, the analog on the West Coast is California, Washington, Oregon, Nevada, Idaho, Utah, and Arizona. You don't lose 17% of your country without feeling it. And in Bangladesh, some of that 17% is big cities, a couple of the big cities. Now, it turns out there's kind of a saving grace, which is flooding, which is what rising seas will do, tends not to kill that many people, the flooding itself. It kills people, but in smaller numbers. What it does, obviously, is it displaces people. So we're not going to get a lot of dead people as a result of rising seas. We're getting a lot of displaced people. And in Bangladesh, a good guess is about 20 million people. Now, when people are displaced, we have a plan that's been used over and over through various crises. And the basics of the plan is you try to allow these people to survive in the most humane conditions possible until you can return them to where they came from after the war is over or after the natural disaster is calmed. That's a really bad plan when the land is flooded by rising oceans, because that land's not coming back. So we have a huge number of refugees, a refugee crisis unlike one we've seen before, and we don't know what to do with them because the off-the-shelf plan doesn't work, right? They've got to go somewhere else. So where do they go? This is a point when you read news stories about that, they say nobody knows where they're going to go, which I say things like that too. I don't mean to criticize that. But in fact, we know quite well where they're going to go. They're going to go to cities if they can. Because if you can't grow food, if you're poor and destitute and you can't grow food on land you're on, the only way to survive is to go to a city in the hopes that somebody will pay you to do something. So they'll go to cities. And they'll go to cities that are already bursting and already overtaxed, that have social structures and infrastructures that are a mess, and they'll put an additional burden on those systems. So those refugees are actually called displaced persons in technical jargon, not refugees, and you only become a refugee when you cross a border, but that's semantics. Those displaced people will arrive in cities and strain an already fragile social structure in those cities. And Bangladesh certainly won't be able to deal with it. So they'll go somewhere else. They'll go to India, they'll go to Myanmar, the 2 countries that border on Bangladesh. Some will manage to get out on boats or planes. One of the ways to get out will be to be a victim of human trafficking, some of whom will land in this country. But basically, those people will have a miserable existence, and we won't know what to do with them. What does that mean globally? So it's something like 20 million in Bangladesh. That's the biggest number, almost certainly. The number globally is hard to predict. There's a huge variance on the estimates. But a not crazy estimate that is not nowhere near the top of the range is about 200 million. 200 million refugees is 1 in 33 people, at least based on today's population, 3%. Again, I don't know what we do with them. Nobody knows what we do with them. If you want to resettle them, right, because again, they can't go back home, how would you do that? Well, you might say, okay, it's a lot of people. We got to spread them out across the world because no one place can take 200 million refugees. How about we do this? How about we send more to countries that are richer, receiving countries that are richer, because they're better able to incorporate them into their societies, to welcome them, even imagining that that's possible. For the United States, that would mean, if GDP is the criteria, if you deliver refugees to countries proportionally based on GDP, the United States gets about 50 million. So can you imagine that debate in Congress? I can't, because there's no debate, right? Nobody wants to say yes to that. It just doesn't happen. So there's no plan that one can imagine for how to deal with 200 million displaced people. So some of those people die, some of those people struggle to survive, some of those people live out their lives in horrendous camps. Some of them manage to find better conditions. And then they also, because there's so many, they cause sort of knock-on damages to the cities they go to the communities they go to. They create ethnic conflict and so on. So that's a very bad outcome with lots of deaths. Not so many caused by the flooding itself, but lots by the sickness after, lots by the problem of dealing with enormous numbers of people who are displaced. Let me switch now. I want to talk about something different. Climate change is going to kill people kind of in the way I've just described. That is, we know the seas are going to go up, we know they're going to flood a lot of land, we know people are going to be displaced, and we know those people are going to fare badly. Climate change is going to do something else as well. It's going to take situations that are already perilous, and it's going to make them worse. It's like turning up the dial on harm or on risk. And in the jargon of climate change, but also in the kind of national security apparatus, this is what's known as a threat multiplier or a risk multiplier. An easy example that I'm not really going to talk about is Israel and the Middle East, right? We all know that that's a dangerous part of the world. We all know that with or without climate change, that part of the world could sort of explode and you could have real violence. Because it's also a water-stressed part of the world, and climate change is going to make it more so, the risk of this outcome, the risk of conflict, is greater in a climate change world than a world without. And if you're anybody, certainly if you're the United States foreign relations people, certainly if you're the United States military, certainly if you live in that part of the world, you care about that. That's a bad thing. And so I want to talk about two other such situations in a little more detail because they're a little less familiar to most people. And these are, I want to think of these in terms of the United States interests. They're devastating for the countries involved, but they're also very bad for the US. The first one is the border between India and Pakistan. Pakistan, another very populous country, should be a desert, and it should be almost uninhabitable, but for the fact that it has a river that flows into it called the Indus River. And I'm going to tell you something about the Indus River, and you're going to know the rest of my story right away. The Indus River begins in glaciers in the Himalayas, which then form the Indus River, which passes through India into Pakistan. So as those glaciers shrink, the value of the water in the Indus River will diminish. And the many millions of people on both sides of the border will have to share that pain of not enough water in already poor parts of the world. So imagine you're the Indian policymaker who's got some responsibility here. Here's the policy choice you have. Option one, figure out some equitable amount of water to let flow into Pakistan. Let's not worry about what's equitable. That's itself a complicated question, but let's suppose we know what that is. Let it go into Pakistan, knowing that that decision will kill lots of people and lots of your citizens in India who will no longer have water, will no longer be able to grow food, will no longer be able to eat. Or use the water as best you can while it's on the Indian side of the border, because it's not your problem what happens in Pakistan. Now what happens on the Pakistan side of the border? Pakistan says, well, we're getting less water, because no matter what India does, they'll get less water, the river's less valuable because the water doesn't come at the right time. They'll get more flooding and then more drought. No matter what, Pakistan gets less valuable water. Then they say, well, is India giving us enough? And we need to know Pakistan and India don't like each other. Since they were independent together in 1947 when Britain left, they've never liked each other. They fought 4 wars in that time. India accuses Pakistan of terrorism. Pakistan has no great reason to trust India. So Pakistan says, are they giving us enough water? Well, one, it's hard to tell, because it's hard to tell how much they're holding back. Like, even if we know how much they're supposed to give us, it's hard to tell whether they're doing it. But secondly, my citizens in Pakistan are dying because they don't have enough water. So I need to get more from India. So what do? I send a diplomat. The diplomat's problem is he gets to India and the Indians say, we don't like you very much, and we're giving you all you're going to get, and that's a fair amount. Right? And that's the end of that conversation. Plan B, if you need a country to do something, you can use economic pressure. Pakistan's a lot smaller than India in absolute size, in economic size. It's a lot poorer than India in per capita GDP. It really has no economic way to pressure India. Option 3, the military. Pakistan's conventional military forces are far smaller than India's, less well equipped, and no match for India's military forces. Pakistan really only has one policy lever, one tool that it has that can match what India has, and that's nuclear weapons. Now, I'm not saying, this is not a prediction, I'm not saying that there will be a nuclear confrontation. I'm saying that that risk already exists even without climate change. It's talked about openly, especially in the Pakistan, not by government officials, but in the Pakistan media it's talked about pretty openly. And as the water crisis gets more severe, as the lives lost get more serious, and as Pakistan faces the prospect of extinction as a country, as that water gets, as the river becomes less and less valuable because it's the only meaningful source of water, you can't be comfortable with the idea that there won't be a nuclear confrontation. Right? It's not a prediction, but we've dialed up the threat of a nuclear conflict between these two big powers. One more example, and then I'll talk about at least something forward-looking, which, well, this is forward-looking too, something less grim that's forward-looking. I want to talk about Nigeria. Now, Nigeria, like much of sub-Saharan Africa, will be devastated by climate change. But I don't want to talk about that as such. I want to talk about it from the American perspective. This is a very parochial kind of point I'm making. Nigeria is important for the U.S. for a couple reasons. One, we import a lot of oil from Nigeria, the same amount more or less as we import from Saudi Arabia. Two, we worry about terrorism, and Nigeria threatens to make it. Right? Nigeria is kind of already arguably a terrorist breeding ground. So the U.S. pays attention to it, and you can actually trace a movement of American resources, security resources, military resources, not to Nigeria uniquely, but to Africa and parts of Africa that are getting more and more attention for these sorts of reasons. As climate change sort of puts a vice grip on Nigeria, to give you an idea, very poor country, something like the agricultural yield of rain-dependent crops, which includes subsistence farming and some other crops, is expected to fall by 50% by 2050. So an already poor country with its food supply being choked out. This is also a country that has massive, serious ethnic divisions, that has massive economic disparities, that has some kind of a, sort of a history or tradition of violence, of internal violence, violent uprisings, and has an extremist Islamic movement in the country. That's not a recipe the United States likes. And as climate change makes life more and more difficult in that country, query whether we feel comfortable as Americans with the idea that we don't know how reliable that supply of oil is, and we don't know what kind of confidence we should have that terrorism will not emerge from Nigeria. And we, a decade ago, lost the idea that we're immune from that kind of international action. So all this to say that neither problems in Nigeria nor problems on the India-Pakistan border inevitably are going to affect the United States in a really massive way. But again, we've dialed up the risk in both cases. And if you dial up the risk, as a probability in enough places, you can be pretty confident that some of them are going to be triggered by that change. So let me now say what I hope my book can contribute to. I think the message that the harm from climate change will be so ubiquitous and so devastating is underappreciated. And I think there's lots of reasons for that, but I think one of the responses when you sort of think about it this way is to recoil and to say, I'm just going to go to work today, and I'm just not going to think about it, right? It's an understandable response. And it's exactly the opposite of what we need. What we need is action, and the action we really need is government action. We need action to change policies. The policy we really need is a more expensive, a higher price on greenhouse gas emissions. And there's essentially one way to do it that comes in two names. One name is the carbon tax, or rather a greenhouse gas emissions tax, and the other is cap and trade. I have preferences over these two, but that's not really important. The point is that that's the path to a sustainable kind of policy on climate change. And our politicians will only walk down that path if we push them down it, because it requires expending resources today for benefits later. We do that. We do it in education, we do it in military, we do it in R&D, we do it in retirement planning. But politicians don't like to do it because they're not going to be in office down the road. So they need to be pushed. They need to be rewarded when they take a stand and they lead. They need to be punished when they walk away from their responsibilities. And in this country, that means all the things that politics means. It means voting, it means volunteering, it means campaign contributions, it means all of those things. And so what I want to suggest is that though the problem is massive and the problem is hard to wrap your brain around, a way to think about it that is a little more encouraging is that if we pull it off, if we manage to start by getting American officials to think about real solutions, and ultimately, perhaps with American leadership one day, get international efforts to do something about it, we will be saving hundreds of millions of lives around the world, including in this country, but around the world. And we will be materially improving the lot of billions of people on the planet, maybe all the people on the planet. That's a pretty good goal. And that, it seems to me, is something that's worth a heavy lift. So if we think of it that way, it seems less daunting, and it seems like something we should try to achieve. And that, if this book has some small contribution to that effort, then I'll be pretty happy. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for those great remarks. I knew you'd find light there at the end of that. We have quite a few questions, and I'm going to start with some questions internationally. Here's a pretty straightforward question. Can we learn anything from the Maldives or other countries that are already proactively looking for new land and solutions to a changing environment?
The Maldives is interesting because they have no international political influence until climate change comes along. And their influence is obviously not, they don't have some kind of power over people, but they have a moral claim. And when you see their islands disappearing, that's a pretty powerful symbol. The best example of a country looking for new land is probably not the Maldives, which is, by the standards of these tiny states, large, but Tuvalu, which is much smaller. You can imagine the Tuvalu population finding a place to live. That is, you could draw up a kind of imagined scenario where Australia or somebody lets them in, or India lets them in and sets them up somewhere. You can't imagine that for Bangladesh. Right? So the small island states have a real serious problem, critical problem, and hopefully the solution is not an attempt at a last-minute rescue while a storm washes over the last of their islands. That is, hopefully it doesn't become that kind of emergency. But the idea of resettling is limited to this kind of systematic resettlement of a community is reserved to a teeny tiny number of people, because as soon as the number gets big, it's impossible to imagine replicating that culture and that community somewhere else.
So this questioner says, the Dutch have figured it out. They've mastered control of the sea and they have a thriving civilization. What can we learn from them? And if the Chinese can build a great wall hundreds of years, and can't we do the same in time to stem the tide? No.
So I actually heard, I think it was this morning, I heard a story that some of you must have heard too, because NPR only has so many stories, about the mayor of Hoboken wanting to build walls around Hoboken. And if I'm the mayor of Hoboken, I probably want to do the same thing. It's not a crazy idea. It's a crazy idea as global policy for a lot of reasons. One is seawalls only address one problem, which is rising seas. They don't address drought. They don't address acidification of oceans. The other problem is seawalls are really expensive. And there's a lot of sea and a lot of coast, and you just can't keep it out. So, and the Dutch, I'm not sure the Dutch would stand up and say, we've come to learn that the answer is to build walls against the sea. That's a non-trivial effort they've undertaken, and I don't think the Dutch would say, no problem, give me the east coast of the United States in a week. I'll take care of it.
So let's turn to food and water issues. This is a statement: isn't global warming in northern Siberia and similarly situated areas a good thing? I.e. longer growing seasons, less difficult for people to live, etc.
So that's true. So I'm Canadian. I'm a dual Canadian-American citizen. So my Canadian friends often make this point to me as they shiver in Edmonton in the middle of January. And it's true. So there will be land that becomes arable, usable in Canada and Russia and places like that. You can get some sense of the balance, the trade-off between the agricultural impacts that are positive and the agricultural impacts that are negative. And it's hard to tell that story in a way that suggests that the net is positive. Plus, those stories usually involve an assumption of what economists call a static equilibrium, meaning we've got a world today that works a certain way. Imagine a change in the climate, wait 500 years while humans adjust, and look at what it's going to look like at the back end. Right? That's kind of the model. You imagine it's actually not so easy to reconfigure our entire economic and social systems, to move cities, to move populations. So it's true that there are some positive effects, that there is some land that will become more usable. But the ability to take advantage of that land is limited and expensive, and it's not really plausible that that the net effect will be positive. But there will be some positive consequences in there.
And as a follow-up to that, at what point does desalination become economically feasible when you extend the growing season?
I don't know the answer to that. I don't know enough about desalination. I know that it's expensive and that it's practiced on small scale, even in places that are extremely water stressed. But I don't know specifically what the cost structure looks like compared to alternatives.
Turning to overpopulation, does your book discuss the impact of human overpopulation and our need to address and slow and decrease it? Won't wars, famine, and disease take care of it?
They might. So I made a sort of strategic decision in the book to understate population growth for the same reason I chose 2 degrees. That is, it makes my argument harder. Population growth all presses towards bigger crises, bigger problems, rather than towards solutions. So it's true that these bad things killing people reduce the population. There's 2 ways that a kind of warming world stops warming. One is that human beings find a way to limit their greenhouse gas emissions in a way that allows an equilibrium to be established between the concentration of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere and the climate on the planet. That's the good idea. The other option is the climate keeps changing and keeps imposing larger and larger and larger costs on us until, because of those costs, we are no longer emitting so many greenhouse gases. And at that point, the planet will reach an equilibrium. The planet's going to be fine. It's us that have a problem. The planet will be here in some state, but if we wait until a natural equilibrium, while we continually try to put out more and more greenhouse gases, those costs get very, very high, very, very fast. And if you talk about, instead of 2 degrees, 6 or 7 or 8 degrees, it's hard to even imagine how bad that is, because the costs don't go up linearly. They go up exponentially, which means going from 1 to 2 degrees has a certain cost. Going from 2 to 3 has a larger cost. 3 to 4 is a larger cost still, right? Every degree is more costly than the last degree.
So this questionnaire says you paint a very dystopian future of global climate. Part of our history in the world is the history of climate change. Why should we believe that this time it is worse?
So it's true the climate's always changed, but it's always changed on kind of tectonic speeds. It changed extremely slowly. We're changing it very, very fast. And part of my point is, again, the planet's going to be fine, but human civilization is not made for this kind of change. We've assumed, as some of the things I mentioned suggest, the oceans are going to be more or less where they are. The rivers are going to be more or less where they are. Rains are going to come more or less in the same place. Not every year in the same amount, but if you're in a place you can grow food, you'll be able to grow food in that place in the future. Those assumptions aren't so good as the climate changes in this way. So it's not that the world's going to disappear. It's that it's all changing, and we've built our societies on the world as it is or was, not on the world as it will be. And that change is going to be difficult.
So I'm going to combine these two questions, and we're getting a lot of fabulous questions here. This is about cities. Should cities begin planning today for a way to integrate these populations, and what are some of the things cities could do to prepare for this? And in tandem with that is, do you see a mass migration of people towards the North Pole and the South Pole that might occur in the future as these areas become more suitable for living? Should we start building on the poles? My question.
So I think it depends on how you imagine this playing out, but it's true, if the temperature goes up 4 degrees, and again, you ask what it's going to look like 500 years from now. If we stabilize at 4 degrees warmer than we are now, Canada is going to have a much, much larger population in 500 years than it has now. I'm sort of less concerned about the 500 years from now scenario than the between now and then. I'm kind of more concerned with the transition. And so that, yeah, I think it's true that the northern climes are going to become less harsh in some ways. But I think it's also a mistake to think that, the people living in Edmonton have it good, because they're going to face higher food prices. They're going to face the same global threats that the United States faces. They're going to face some of the same agricultural problems, in the sense that, to the extent water isn't available where it used to be, the farms that used to grow the food won't be able to do it. The people who rely on that food won't be able to live there. Right? They'll have many of the same dislocations. There'll be some compensation. They'll have some new arable land available. It'll be a little more pleasant to go outside. And I think that will, and people will be fleeing much of the rest of the world, which isn't really going to be fun for Edmonton either. So it's true. There's a version of this argument that the questioner doesn't seem to be making, but I'm going to put forward because I can knock it down. There's a version of this argument that I call the climate change winner argument, that says we're going to do better than those guys, so we don't have to worry about it. But it's not those guys we want to do better than. We'd like to be better off tomorrow than we are today, and that's not where we're headed, really, for any country in the world.
So Brandon at Mills High School has a couple of questions regarding Asia and China. And I'll read the first one. Currently, developing nations like China and India refuse to enter alliances like the Kyoto Protocol to address the climate change situation. How can developed nations like the U.S. push developing nations that contribute to climate change to take action?
So it's certainly true that a real solution requires participation of all the major emitters, which includes India and China. The United States hasn't joined the Kyoto Protocol either, so the U.S. has a little hard time seizing the moral high ground on this. Part of the reason the book is framed as it is, that is, it's knowingly targeted at an American audience, though hopefully not ignoring the realities of the rest of the world, is until the United States itself is willing to accept the idea of a global climate change agreement, we're not going to get one. So I think of it this way. Imagine that the United States was at the table with Europe, India, China, Russia, Brazil. You've got a lot of the global emissions at the table. And imagine that someone produces an agreement, and the question for the United States is, will you agree to these terms, knowing, just for the purpose of the example, that everyone else will comply and there's some equitable distribution of pain? I don't think the U.S. agrees to that deal right now. I don't think the United States wants an equitable agreement that reduces greenhouse gases. Until we do, I think the hope for an international solution is almost zero, because the United States is too central a player. I don't think anyone else has the capacity to persuade the United States in an important way, or to provide a set of incentives that move the U.S. I think the converse might be true. It might be possible for the U.S. to persuade India and even China to move on this. And in China's defense, China's talking about a carbon tax. You never know in China whether they mean it, where it would actually go, but China's at least making noises about it in a way that the United States doesn't very often.
This question comes from Peter Waldman. Can you give us other examples of current tangible impacts on human populations, such as your opening example of Bolivia? What stuff is happening already?
So there are a lot of things happening already, though they're happening on a small scale relative to where they will. There's an estimate that is controversial, I think, that 150,000 people a year are killed by climate change today. Some think it's more than that. Some dispute that number. But some things that are happening today, so a lot of bad things are happening in Africa because Africa gets all the bad stuff in life first. So in sub-Saharan Africa, because they're near the equator, because they're very poor already and have very little margin to adapt, when their climate changes, they suffer a lot. And that's in the kinds of ways I already discussed about access to water and things like that. There's also a spread of the range of malaria, which, not dramatically, but you can identify places where it previously was not and it is now. And there's something horrible about that spread because not only do more people get exposed to malaria, but there are people who haven't been exposed to it who's in the past. So there's a kind of cruel balance that malaria strikes with populations where lots of kids die early in their life, and people who are not prone to dying from malaria survive. But when malaria arrives somewhere new, that deal hasn't been struck yet. And so malaria has to kill a lot of people who would have been killed as children if they'd been in a malaria-prone area. So that's happening in some small places. We see sea rise happening. One of the little factoids in the book, I'm not sure I'm going to get the numbers right, I'm certain I'm not going to get the numbers right. Some years ago, London built gates for the Thames River to protect against storms. And the estimate was they'd close them. These numbers are right. I just can't remember what year they built it. It was in the 1980s, I believe, but it might have been the 1990s. The projection was they'd close these gates once or twice a year in the face of storms. They're closing them more like 10 times a year now because the storms are stronger than were projected. You can't talk about what's happening without saying Katrina and Sandy. We don't know for sure those are caused by climate change. This is a little bit like the back end of the India-Pakistan problem. We know the probability of a storm like Sandy is higher today than it was 30 years ago. So when one happens, it might have been because of that, or it might have happened anyway. We don't know for sure, but we shouldn't take comfort in that because we know that some of the storms we see will be because of climate change. And the people affected don't really care what the cause was, right? So if you've got more storms, that's worse. So that's a few things.
This question comes from a student. Is it really worth the money to pour in billions of dollars to delay the sea level rise from rising 10 to 20 feet by 2050? Is it not inevitable that the oceans will rise and consume sea level and lower the sea level countries and lower their sea level countries and communities?
I think the answer to that question is there's disagreement on what concentration of greenhouse gases is low enough that we can bear the costs. So the number that prominent speakers kind of warning about climate change used to say it was 450 parts per million. We're somewhere around 390 parts per million today. More recently, some of those same people have revised their view downward to 350 parts per million, not because they've decided at a whim to change their minds, but because some of these people are serious scientists. They've looked at the science and they've said, whoa, what we thought was going to be happening at a much higher concentration seems to be happening now. So to keep the pain within thresholds we can manage, we got to get down to 350. But the choice of how much or how we respond in terms of curbing our greenhouse gas emissions is in part that choice. Where do you want to set the global thermostat? It's more expensive to set it lower in terms of the cost of mitigation, the cost of reducing greenhouse gases. But it's also the costs of not doing that are more expensive in the impact side, the kinds of things I'm talking about. If you don't curb the emissions of greenhouse gases, then the price to be paid through all the kinds of things I'm talking about and many more is higher. So you're dealing with those different costs. Nobody knows exactly what they are, but we have a pretty good idea of how they trade off against one another, and that's kind of the decision.
We have quite a few questions on international efforts and leadership, and I'll read a couple of them to you. Are there any international bodies that can deal with the problems of climate change? What is the best way to affect policy change? And was any progress made at the last round of international negotiations, and how can we move this conversation forward?
So I'm an international law professor, which requires me to believe certain things about international law. One of those things is if you have a conference and the countries come together and they make a bunch of statements that most people view as meaningless face-saving gestures, there's always a question about whether, in fact, it means something. So most recently, and I'm not kidding about this if you don't already know it, a commitment was made to enter into a commitment by 2015 to address the problem. You know, I don't know how important, that's better than not, I guess, but, Kyoto was a real attempt. It hasn't really paid off. It hasn't had a big impact, but it was a real attempt. In answer to the first question, there isn't really a place. In international trade, there's the World Trade Organization. There isn't really something like that, but there are a set of organized conferences that take place annually. The international community's on this in that sense. They're meeting about it, they're talking about it, they're worrying about it. It's not a secret. One of the things that nobody's asked about kind of the science and whether it's real or not, which is a good sign. One of the things that is hard to square with the kind of denial industry that exists is it's hard to find a country that doesn't go to these meetings that says we're just not worried, even the United States. Right? Now, they may not be willing to enter into commitments at this stage, hopefully soon. But there is a set of organized conversations, and part of international law involves lots of this kind of wheels spinning and talking to each other. And the hope is that at some point something really important will pop out of it. And we don't seem close right now.
When we spoke earlier, you talked a little bit about Obama's State of the Union address and his promise to take up climate change. Can you talk a little bit about that, Andrew, and what your view is that you'll see happen from the White House over the next couple of years?
Yeah, so because I'm of the view that the solution has to come through government policy, and though California is doing important things, and I think what California is doing can make a difference, ultimately I think it has to be federal policy. I have to then think about the fact that what federal action can I imagine? And it's a lot easier to imagine it coming from the White House than from the Capitol. So when President Obama says, I want to do something about climate change, I think, okay, that's better than saying climate change isn't real. When he says, I want Congress to do something about climate change, I say, that sounds like hiding behind someone's skirts. But then when he says, and if Congress doesn't, I will use the power of the executive office to do something. And he has power to do something. That is putting reputation on the line. That is Obama putting himself in a position where when Congress does nothing, which they surely will, he will either have to take action which will get some political response, negative political response from some quarters, or not take action and then be criticized rightly for having said he would, right? He didn't have to do that. He could have made the same State of the Union speech and just said, climate change is really important, this is a congressional issue, I'll wait for Congress to send me a bill. He did more than that. That to me is hopeful. It's not the solution to all my problems, but it's hopeful. And I actually am a little bit optimistic on this because though Congress looks hopeless right now, I have some perhaps unduly optimistic view that we're not that far from even Congress being able to do something on this. Not now, and not 2014. I'm not crazy, but hopefully not too far from that.
This question comes from Lynn in the East Bay. Please comment on intergenerational conversations concerning climate change and the obligations of our generation towards our children and on down.
So that's a great question. Let me give you the economist answer first and then the human beings answer second. If you push on someone who doesn't want to take action on climate change, the place they end up, if they're reasonable people, is the discount rate. It's exactly this question. It's why should we spend money now to solve this problem instead of either spending money later when we're going to be richer, assuming economic growth continues, or just living with it later. And so there's lots of answers to that. The human being answer to that, I guess I'm making the economists out to be the bad guys, which I don't want to do because I'm an economist. I just mean the language is convenient. The language of economics that makes it easy to make that argument. There's lots of answers. One is the economic gains from this pollution, which is what it is, the greenhouse gases we're putting in the atmosphere, is falling to us. We're getting the benefits. The economically well understood principle is that the cost of the thing should be tied to its use. That is, we will get better allocation of resources if the person who uses a resource has to pay for it, has to pay for its full cost, in this case, including this pollution. That suggests we should have to pay for it when we use it, having nothing to do with discount rates. But another answer is, and to the high school students, this is on a timeline that affects my lifetime. And I'm at least 5 years older than the high school students. So for high school and college students, they're in their prime of their lives when some of these really severe impacts are happening. They're not the most severe impacts because the most severe impacts don't arrive until we reduce our emissions. Right? They just go bigger and bigger and bigger. We can't wait it out. It just gets worse until we address it. So anyway, the answer, I guess I should get back to the question, which is, I find it difficult to say with a straight face that we just shouldn't care about a generation that is 30 years away or 50 years away or even 100 years away. I'm glad that the people who fought in the Second World War didn't have that attitude, that they didn't say, yeah, Americans didn't say, oh yeah, it's a disaster. But if we do nothing and Nazi Germany conquers Europe, it'll take them decades to mess with us, right? I'm glad they didn't do that. And, we invest a massive amount in our kids, in time and resources and money and sleep. And it just can't be that we don't care. There's easier ways to raise kids if you don't care what they look like when they turn 30. So I just don't believe we don't care about the future.
Thank you. We have quite a few questions from people in this room, sort of what can we do? And I want to read some of them to you. There's also healthy skepticism that our politicians are going to agree on a solution. So turning to the threat of climate change, this questionnaire says, the threat of climate change appears to be big and only able to be solved by cooperation on the national level. What can we as citizens pursue at the community level to help this problem? If you had to suggest one thing for everyone in this room to do in the next week or two to help solve this problem, what would it be? What do you recommend students do to speed awareness about climate change? And what are the most important changes we can make for the environment, and which ones are futile? And I'll use that as our last question.
Okay, I don't think I'm going to be able to address each of those specific things, but it's a fair question. So I say what I really am concerned with is government policy at the national level, maybe at the state level for a big state like California. But it's entirely appropriate for people to say to me, well, that's all well and good, but when I'm not voting, what else can I do? And I'm certainly of the view that individuals can and should behave as responsibly as possible in their lives. That means all the things you think. It means driving a more fuel-efficient car, driving in a more fuel-efficient fashion. It means recycling in appropriate ways. It means heating and cooling your house more moderately. All those sorts of things. It means trying to reduce your carbon footprint. And you can go online and there's carbon footprint calculators that'll tell you what they are. But brace yourself that it's not pretty if you're an American to look at your carbon footprint, especially if you know what carbon footprints are in the rest of the world. So there's all kinds of things individuals can do. Communities can do things too. So cities, and this is what's happened in the United States, is because there's been a sense that the federal government's paralyzed. Cities and states have done things, which is impressive because they're not capturing most of the benefits, right? San Francisco reduces its greenhouse gas emissions to the extent there's a benefit, it's the whole world that's gaining the benefit. And to the extent there's a cost, it's all borne by San Francisco, right? So that's a kind of impressive act to be willing to bear those costs. I think that's useful and important. And I think in California, maybe the most important thing, though the actual reduction in emissions, if California has good policies in place, are important. California as a model for the country is very important, indeed internationally, because California does lead on these things. And the same is true for cities. Cities can be models for states or even for the country, right? And they can be laboratories for different policies. I think all of these things on all dimensions are important. When I say that federal policy is really what's needed, I don't in any way mean to be dismissive of policies at all other levels. Those are important. They're not the ultimate solution, but they're good. And so I think in terms, I try to emphasize the government policy because I don't want anyone to fall into to be satisfied with the idea that they themselves are doing the best they can in their household or that their community or even their state is doing a fair bit, right? California could say, we're kind of doing pretty well relative to everybody. Even relative to Europe, California is not doing too badly. But I don't want to suggest that that's enough because we can't ultimately get a solution until we get both the national governments of the big emitters to work together in some way to curb our greenhouse gas emissions and to limit the concentrations of these poisons in our atmosphere.
Well, with that, we're going to have to conclude our program. On behalf of the World Affairs Council, please join me in thanking Andrew Guzman for his excellent talk and discussion.